Well, thank you very much for your patience. And hello, everyone. Welcome to our opening lecture for the annual EU Jean Monnet Center Conference. My name is Marcus Thiel. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at FIU. And I'm also directing the EU Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, which is an EU-funded outreach and research center. As part of our 3-year grant, focusing on the overall theme of social inclusion, this year we organized this year's conference on the topic of race, asylum, and migration in Europe and beyond. This is particularly topical, right, because we're now facing the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Then we also just had the Turkish-Syrian earthquake that heavily damaged the region. And if you don't mind, if we could just have a moment of silence for the victims of the earthquake. Thank you for coming. Thank you. And of course, I would hope that we all also feel inclined to kind of support major organizations, right? Be it UNICEF or the UN refugees or anyone that can help in this tragedy. But that being said, close to 5 million Ukrainian refugees have sought protection in Europe over just 1 year, right? In the hope that they may be able to return home. We don't know the migratory pressures coming out of this earthquake, and there are certain governments already that are pronouncing that, their fences are ready to deal with the migratory pressures that may arise from there. So, that being said, immigration and asylum have become really politically loaded terms, right? Not only in Europe, but also all over the world, including in the US. But they also become central issues at the heart of European policy construction. And while it is widely accepted among scholarship that migrants and refugees contribute to societies if they're appropriately integrated, the last few years were marked in the European Union by a wide contestation that probably all of you are familiar over an effective policy that on the one hand is acceptable to the member states, right, who want often more restrictive policies, but also one that at the same time aims to fulfill the appropriate human rights standards that the EU has set for himself and that they need to comply with according to the UN. This contestation also, of course, occurs here in Florida, we all are aware, which has become a battleground for minority rights, where racial and gender minorities, as well as refugees, have been securitized for the self-serving ambitions of Floridian politicians. I won't say any names, but you know what to do. But our invited experts can tell us more about this complex topics. We're excited to open today with a keynote lecture by Professor Arancha González, the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po Paris, one of the top schools in international affairs, and former Spanish minister. You will hear more about her bio in a second. Tomorrow, we'll have a full day then of academic panels organized that comprehensively explore all the different areas surrounding, the racial impact, the gender impact, even the migration and refugee issues, how they relate to other places, including the United States, and how civil society plays a role in mitigating the shortcomings of governments in those areas. But before we begin, I want to quickly thank the European Commission, which has graciously funded our research and outreach activities as the center, as well as our collaborative partners here at FIU, the European Eurasian Studies Program, the Václav Havel Human Rights Initiative, the Dorothea Green Lecture Series, and then including our colleagues that are here, that I can name individually, in SIPA, the Green School of International Public Affairs, as well as especially here our interim dean, Jean Medinar, and our senior director for strategic service, Pedro Botta, without whom this would have not been possible. Particular thanks goes to my right hand, Christine Cully. Christine, where are you? You deserve a big hand. And our PhD candidate, Ernesto Fiorchetto. Thank you. We were really the main organizers, as well as our student assistants. I also want to recognize our other honorable community guests, including Brian Siegel, including Ambassador Volker Anding, and others that I may have not seen here in the mess of people. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, wonderful to meet you as well. See you again. Hi. And of course, our keynote speaker and our experts from, if you stay around for tomorrow's lectures, you will hear much more of them. I want to hand it over to my colleague, Dean Shlomi Dinar, so you can say a few words and introduce our distinguished keynote speaker. Dr. Dinar himself is an internationally renowned expert on environmental politics and dean of the school and a great supporter of our program. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Marcus. My name is Shlomi Dinar. I'm interim dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to the keynote address kicking off the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Conference. The keynote is titled Approaches to Migration, Asylum and Race in Europe. For their support of this conference, I would like to thank, and I know Marcus, you've already thanked them, but I want to thank them as well, the European Commission, the Dorothea Green Lecture Series, the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Democracy, and the European and Eurasian Studies Program. A special thank you to you, Dr. Marcus Steele, Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations and Director of the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet European Center of Excellence, Christine Cully, Associate Director of the Jean Monnet Center and Program Manager of the European and Eurasian Studies Program. Both Marcus and Christine worked very hard in planning and organizing this conference. And for all your work, absolutely. And for all his work and all for your work, I'm looking at you, I also want to thank Mr. Ernesto Fiorchetto, PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and International Relations. So thank you. During this conference, experts from FIU and other academic institutions in the United States and Europe will address issues related to migration, asylum, and race in Europe through a variety of lenses. In tonight's keynote address, and in 3 panel discussions tomorrow, we will examine theoretical and historical context, policy and legal development, and civil society responses from local and global perspectives. Discussions about refugees and migrants to Europe tend to focus on the year 2015, when over 1 million asylum seekers poured into Europe, mainly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And of course, 2022, when a massive number of Ukrainians fled their country after the Russian invasion. But the subject predates 2015. In fact, for over 2 decades, there has been a growing debate about issues related to refugees and migrants across the borders of Europe. Migration and asylum bring up questions of cultural identity, national culture, cultural diversity, and the integration of minority communities. In some European countries, these questions have generated political mobilization and passionate debate. I'm looking forward to digging into this fascinating and significant these topics with all of you. To kick off our conference, we are fortunate to have as our keynote speaker, Arancha González Laya, Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. Ms. Gonzalez will speak about Europe's quest for a secure, safe, and sustainable migration compact based on shared values. Before she joined the Paris School of International Affairs, Ms. Gonzalez served as Spain's Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union, and Cooperation. She previously was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the International Trade Center. From 2005 to 2013, she served as Chief of Staff to the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Before that, she held senior positions at the European Commission in the areas of international trade and development. A Spanish national, Ms. Gonzalez holds a degree in law from the University of Navarra and postgraduate degree in European law from University Carlos III of Madrid. I must add that we are all excited to be hosting Arancha González for another reason. The Paris School of International Affairs is one of the top schools of international affairs in the world. It is also a full member of the prestigious Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, or APSIA. In September of 2021, the Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs became a full member of APSIA, and we are honored to be welcoming a fellow dean to speak at FIU and engage with our students, our faculty, and community as we look for ways to collaborate with Sciences Po and the Paris School of International Affairs. With that, please join me in welcoming Dean Arancha González Laya.
Thank you very much to the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Needless to say, as a European, Jean Monnet is a light that has guided me in my life and in my career, so it's very exciting to be here to speak at this center at the Florida International University, a fellow member of the Fraternity of the Schools of International Affairs. This fraternity is a big and solid one. We like to support each other, and this is one of the very important reasons why I'm here today. But I'm also here because this topic of migration is very dear to my heart. And it's dear to my heart because I can see how important it is to manage it with compassion, to manage it with a safe pair of hands, with firmness, but to manage it. Because the lesson we have learned, at least this is the lesson in Europe, is that if we do not manage it properly, if we do not frame discussions and debates about migration, if we do not act on the many different facets that migration brings about, migration ends up polluting our politics, polluting our political debate, and weakening our societies, and weakening our democracies. So what I will try to do today, if you allow me, is to briefly walk through how the European Union is managing the issue of migration. This is a difficult journey in Europe, and it's difficult because it's not easy. There is not one button that you can push that can give us the magic answer. We need to work along different strands. This is why this debate has been framed for the purposes of this conversation about Europe's quest for a secure, safe, sustainable migration compact, which is anchored on shared values. Let me begin by saying that migration is obviously as old as humanity. So this is not a new phenomenon that all of a sudden we are finding. People have felt the desire or the need to migrate for many reasons across history. Sometimes because the opportunities were elsewhere. Very often because war was at home. Other times because there was persecution for religious grounds, persecution for racial grounds, persecution for sexual grounds. More recently, people are fleeing because they have nowhere to live. This is the new phase of migration, which is climate migration. This is why in the legal statutes of all these people, men and women that have been crossing borders for centuries, we have different classifications. We have people that are refugees, we have asylum seekers, and we have migrants, to reflect the different levels of vulnerability that these people face. In Europe, migration has a very difficult history because it's also associated with 2 world wars, and also a commitment to build a European Union where not only goods, capital and services would flow, but also where people will be able to move freely. And this is why in Europe migration has a basis. It's the UN 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. This is where the legal framework of the European Union is anchored, applying Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I quote, "Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution." This is the commitment that we have, all nations within the UN have undertaken. This UN Convention defines who is a refugee, what are the rights of asylum beneficiaries, and what are the responsibilities of nations to grant asylum. Obviously, 51 was then, in 1967 there was an amendment and an update to take into account change in circumstances. In the EU, the issue of migration is part of our legal rulebook, is the Treaty on the European Union. In the chapter, and it's interesting to look at the chapter where these provisions are located, is a chapter on freedom, security, and justice. I say this because the words that we choose, how we frame this discussion, is almost as important as how to manage migration. It's Article 67 and 78 of the EU Treaty that speak of the absence of control for people that are within the European Union, irrespective of their nationalities, provisions that speak of the checks on the people and the effective monitoring of those that are crossing the external borders of the European Union, and provisions that introduce some sort of integrated management for the EU's external borders. So, essentially, if I look at the European Union, what we have, in addition to these 3, is also a common policy on asylum with a temporary protection to third country nationals, the idea that we don't non-refoulement, that we do not send people back in accordance with the provisions of the Geneva Convention of 1951, and common policies on migration. Common policies that speak of efficient management of the migratory flows, that speak of fair treatment of third country nationals that reside legally within the European Union member states, provisions that speak of combating illegal migration and human trafficking. This is an area that I am also particularly attached to, because I have seen how much the misery of people obliged to move is used as a huge business for people that thrive on other people's miseries. Finally, in the EU legal framework, there is also in this articles on freedom, on justice, and on security, there are provisions for the readmission by countries of origin or countries of transit of those that find themselves in the European Union through irregular means. The anchor to the policies of the European Union is to find a right balance between solidarity and responsibilities. And it's this fine balance between solidarity and responsibility that we need to constantly manage, understanding that this balance obviously looks very different depending on where you sit in the European Union. It is very different depending on what your political affiliation is. It is very different depending on whether you have external borders or a landlocked country. And it is all these different dimensions that the EU is daily confronted with to try and find this difficult balance. My background is in international trade, so you will bear with me, but I like figures. And I like discussions to begin with figures, so that we get an idea about the size. What is it that we are talking about? Let me give you some figures, not too many, but a few. In the EU, we are close to 450 million citizens, out of which 24 million are non-EU, meaning they come from countries that are not from the European Union. 5% of them. Out of 190 million workers in the European Union, that's the labor market, 8.8 are non-EU citizens, basically 5% of our total. These 5% are overrepresented in some sectors and underrepresented in others. Where are they overrepresented? Cleaning services, tourism services, building, agriculture, mining. Where are they underrepresented? Education, healthcare, professional services, highly regulated sectors where the presence of migrant workers is very small, not to say in some instances inexistent. Let's look at refugees. 27 million refugees worldwide, 53 million internally displaced worldwide. The share of refugees in the total EU population, 0.6%. 630,000 asylum seekers in the EU. Around 300,000 get a positive response. Where are these asylum applications coming from? Venezuela, Georgia, Colombia, Albania, Moldova. Add to this the over 4 million, close to 5 million internally displaced Ukrainians that find themselves today in the European Union. So if one were to assess migration through the lens of mathematics or statistics, we would say this is a very small issue. But migration is not an issue of numbers. Migration is about people. Migration is about religion. Migration is about race. Migration is about poverty. Migration is also about insecurity. And it's all these different features that collide with a more rational view of migration, which is looking at the figures. And this is why this discussion cannot only be a discussion about numbers, because the numbers do not allow us to manage properly all the sensitivities around them. But we also have to use numbers, because the numbers also help us in putting this discussion into a context. Let me maybe zoom in with a bit of a historical perspective on how we got to today on migration in the European Union. The EU, after the Second World War, at the beginning of the EU construction, the EU was full of migrants. Migrants that had left the EU, migrants that had come to the EU. So at the beginning of the EU construction, migration was not an issue. It was essentially until the 90s, a discussion was about how to ensure the internal mobility of EU nationals. We were building the European Union. So the point was not about who was coming from outside, but rather how to make sure that those within the EU could move. How to make sure that the German could travel to Italy and the Belgium could travel to the Netherlands. And not only travel, but work, have his certificates recognized, have a protection, have rights in the other territories. So, but in the 90s, this was not. It was all about an internal game in the European Union. But in the 90s, obviously, the EU was preparing for the accession of new EU member states, and with it came the expansion of the external borders of the European Union. And then came the need to look more closely at how to manage migration into the European Union, not just intra-EU mobility. Treaty of Amsterdam, 1999, started developing provisions on migration. Treaty of Lisbon, 2009, that starts considering migration as an integral part of these policies that would be covered under the community method in the EU, that would be subject to common policies. Through to 2014, and I will make a distinction between 2015 after and before. Through to 2014, developments on migration could be summed up in 4 ingredients. Ingredient number 1, the interplay between the Schengen Agreement, meaning the possibility that people could have to move freely within the European Union, and the interplay between Schengen and common European asylum policies. Who would deal with asylum seekers? The first country where the asylum seeker would find itself would be responsible for dealing with the request for asylum. So the first pillar of the migration policy was about the standards of control, harmonized procedures of visas, and the description of exceptional circumstances under which the provisions on free movement within the EU could be basically pushed under brackets temporarily, which were the crisis moments when this could be basically where mobility within the EU could be limited. And the interplay between these provisions and asylum applications. With a decision, again in 2013, to set up common criteria for asylum seeking, for treating asylum seekers in the EU, understanding that the decision is a national decision. There is no such thing as a European decision on granting asylum. It's a national decision. But what the EU did was, by 2013, have common criteria so that the decisions that the EU members would take would not be too divergent. And it created an EU asylum support office to help members that needed to manage asylum seekers. The second system, element of the system was essentially an integrated system for border management and border controls. Having a record of who is knocking at the EU doors was important, and doing this in a manner that all members would contribute to it and all members would have a look into it, because it was important to identify if a criminal was entering into the EU, that all the members had knowledge of that. Or if a member state had to decide on giving a visa to someone to enter into the EU, for all the members to understand whether or not this person had was a risk to the European Union. So, integrated system for border controls and for management. With the creation of an agency in 2008, Frontex, to provide technical aid to member states that were facing particular pressures. The third element was to have a framework for legal labor migration? What are the conditions to grant work and residence permits to workers coming into the EU? Again, the decisions are national. We do not have in the EU a European decision about when a worker can come into the EU, but rather a set of conditions that every member is meant to apply, that discusses which skills, which qualifications, which rights, and how can these people freely move within the EU. The fourth provisions have to do with cooperation with third countries. These third countries are very important. Sometimes they are at the origin of the migrants. Sometimes they are transit countries. But they are important because if someone finds itself irregularly in the European territory, those countries have to readmit those nationals unless readmission is a threat to the individual. So this is a system that exploded in 2015. In 2015, Europe faced, some people call it a migration crisis. I think it is a wrong denomination. The EU faced a crisis in the management of a large influx of migrants. That would be a more accurate way of describing what happens in the EU. So, in the space of a few weeks, 1.3 million people, mostly Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, Nigerians, Eritreans, and the sort, arrived into the European Union. They were fleeing from war or conflict. Many of them were not Christian. Many of them were not white. And they came in the space of a few weeks, arrived at the border of the EU, and moved across a number of countries where they did not want to settle towards Germany, which is where many of them wanted to go. They came mostly through Greece, by land, something we hadn't seen before, because before they mostly came by boat from the Mediterranean into the southern part of the European Union. Spain, Italy, Greece. All of a sudden they came through Greece into Central Europe towards Germany. What happened was countries started closing borders, and it created a domino effect until Germany decided that it would temporarily suspend the rule that says that asylum seekers get to be treated in the first country of the European Union where they enter. They suspended this clause and decided that they would be the ones treating those requests for asylum in Germany. So essentially what happened was a breakdown, and obviously this created enormous turbulence in many EU member states. EU who rushed to negotiate a set of agreements with the country that was contiguous to the European Union and from where these migrants were, these refugees, asylum seekers, were transiting, which was Turkey. The EU undertook to negotiate a set of agreements with Turkey through which the EU would provide a set of financial incentives for Turkey to be the guarantor of asylum seekers, refugees, but migrants would not move into the European Union. The lesson, basically, there was a breakdown in this fine balance between solidarity and responsibility. So 2015 showed the need for the European Union to change its system, to move from a crisis-led response to building a more robust system that would find this balance between responsibility and solidarity. And to do this at a time when Europe is becoming an old continent and where there is a growing need in many sectors for skills that Europe is not producing today. So it's in 2020 that the new Commission and the leadership of President Ursula von der Leyen put on the table a package that is still today being negotiated between the member states. Let me give you a few elements of this package, where it has tried to respond to some of the failings of the system we had until 2015. First, faster, more efficient procedures. You can't have people waiting for months and months and months. You need to move fast. And being faster required making sure that every citizen that would get to an EU border would be registered in a central registry. Up until then, member states decided whether or not to share this data with each other. Why? Because whatever is not registered, you can simply open the door and let it go to another country. Like this, you pass the responsibility on to somebody else. So, faster procedure and one common repository, integrated system to record every person that comes into the European Union. The principle that all member states have to contribute to solidarity in times of stress. So there is no possible to say, sorry, it's not good for me, I'm not going to do it. Every member state has to contribute, but flexibility in terms of what kind of contribution each member state would offer. And at first it could be voluntary, but if the situation gets bad, this is a compulsory contribution. And this includes solidarity in terms of disembarkations in case of search and rescue, which is a hot issue in the Mediterranean. The third improvement in the package is a change in paradigm with third countries. And this is a very important one, because at the end of the day, you need a partnership with the countries of origin and transit in order to manage more effectively migration. You need to work in partnership with countries of origin and transit if you want to fight against people trafficking. You need a sense of partnership with the other countries if they are to readmit those that are irregularly in the European Union. So new paradigm working with a sense of partnership with third countries, understanding that the bulk of asylum seekers and refugees are in reality in those partner countries. Also, fourth element, stricter frameworks for returns. Returning those that are irregular is difficult. And sometimes EU member states prefer to take a shortcut. You open the door and let it go to another EU member state. Like this, you dispose of the problem, quote unquote. So stricter framework for returns with a stronger role for the EU border and coast guards. Fifth element, credible legal migration and integration policies. Credible is the right word. Talent partnerships with partner countries. An action plan to ensure integration of migrants that are in the European Union. Developing community sponsorship programs. Developing instruments at the EU level that would integrate much faster those that are in the EU including them into the labor market, including them into the education system, including them into the life in the different communities and in the different member states. Sixth element, fighting smuggling and people trafficking. And this has become, and I think here in Florida we can say this has become a much bigger business on illicits than drug trafficking or weapon trafficking. It's human trafficking. Now, this cannot work by working this bilaterally. You require an international effort to track those networks, to dismantle their financing mechanisms, to dismantle the support operations they have within our countries. So a concerted effort to build, through information exchanges and operational measures, the means to fight against people trafficking. Finally, also a commitment to work with other countries that are hosts of incredibly important communities of refugees and asylum seekers, whether it's Niger, whether it's Rwanda, whether it is Turkey, whether it is Jordan, whether it is Lebanon. The list is very long. These are the countries that have massive amounts of refugees and asylum seekers within their territory. So a real commitment to support them in their endeavors. All of this is work in progress. And I cannot tell you that we have found this magic balance between responsibility and solidarity. I can tell you that the more time passes and the more we are engulfed in multiple crises, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whether it's the mounting debt difficulties that many countries in the EU neighborhood are facing, with the combined impact of debt generated to fight the COVID, and now debt augmented by the measures that many countries have had to take to cushion the impact of fuel, food and fertilizers prices, will probably mean a weakening of many of our neighbors, and with this, the obvious pressures that will come on the migratory front. I want to add a final note before I give the floor back to you. The hard lesson that we learned from not managing properly the 2015 migratory influx in the EU. It had a terrible impact on politics. It polarized European politics. It led to the rise in extreme right parties in the European Union, all across, from north to south, from east to west of the European Union, with a toxic impact on social debates and on political life. So, what have we learned? We need to be better at anticipating. We need to invest more on forecasting, anticipating where the difficulties will come from. And it's not that difficult because we know where there are lots of weak links, weak chains that we need to pay more attention to. Second lesson we have learned, we have to anticipate the EU borders. We have to move the external border of the EU to the countries where a lot of people who want to come to the European Union find themselves. We should not wait until they've crossed swimming the Mediterranean to pay attention to them. The borders have to be anticipated. And the third one, we need to fight criminality with all our strength. This is also a way, a commitment to ensuring that our citizens feel that we are not abandoning other citizens in the hands of criminals. So either we manage migration, either we work to find this find balance, or it's our democracies that will be in the balance. This is what I wanted to share with you. Again, sharing this from the perspective of someone that has had to work on migration from different vantage points. I've had to work on migration from a national point of view. Spain is a country that has a large amount of migrants in its territory, that has a large amount of refugees and asylum seekers, that faces also the weaponization of migration by some of our neighbors. I've also had to manage migration from a different perspective, and maybe this has been very instructive to me. I've seen migration through the eyes of a UN, United Nations agency, working to help empower many of these migrants in the countries of origin, help to work to make the economies and social protection networks in these countries more solid, so that people did not feel the urge to pay criminals to go to hell in the Mediterranean. So maybe this has shown me that first, there is a way to manage it, but second, that these ways are hard, they are multifaceted, and we have to put all our strength and our efforts to make them work. Thank you very much, and obviously the floor back to you.
Thank you very much for your insightful introduction to the topic. Now we have, I think, about half an hour left for question and answers. So it would be wonderful if we only have one mic. Usually there's Christine here. If you could maybe step to the podium if you have a question, to the microphone, better. Introduce yourself quickly and then please ask a question. Thank you very much.
My name is Arancha González, community. And I was thinking of the role of the United States. I'm thinking, for example, migration from Colombia to the United States. If the door of the United States is closed, it may be, not for a fact, that the second alternative is Europe. So, any discussion between the United States and the EU in terms of what happens to those Latin Americans that want to come here first, but are not given an opportunity, then basically
Thank you, Rafael. Let me tell you that many migrants from Latin America come to Spain already. It's just that they don't do this in this very in the manner in which the collective image in Europe is of migrants, which is crossing the Mediterranean in dinghy boats. They come, they buy a plane ticket, and they land in Madrid. Or they buy a plane ticket to Amsterdam, and then they land in Madrid. Or they buy a plane ticket to Amsterdam or to Paris, and they drive to Madrid. They are with us. In Spain, there is 500,000 Venezuelans. There's 300,000 Colombians. There's 300,000 Ecuadorians. The list is long. They are probably less prominent in the public discourse because they speak Spanish, because they are not Muslims, because they are like you and me. So they are less of an issue, but they are there. Now, so whether or not the US closes its borders, it's a marginal increase. So for us in Europe and for us in Spain, this discussion is not so much about how the US and Europe make sure that we control that, but how do we manage it? Now, why are Colombians coming to the US or to Europe? Why are Venezuelans coming to the US or Europe? Why are Nicaraguans coming to the US and Europe? Why are Hondurans and El Salvadorians coming to the US. And what we need to do, the US working with the EU, is work much closer on working with the governments in the region, or with the actors in the region, to improve the situation in many of these countries. Now, I tell you, having been there, it's easier to say it than to do it. But if not, the first line should not be a toughening or strengthening of the migration policies. We need proper migration policies, don't get me wrong. When I went to Parliament, I had to be very clear about what our game plan was, what we were doing, what we wanted to do, and what we did not want to do. But I know, Rafael, that if we really are serious about migration, then we have to work to improve the standards of living of people in many of these countries. We need to work and redouble our efforts to resolve a number of political crises that are really bringing desperate people to where they can feed themselves or have health care. We need to, in a nutshell, also work on the root causes of these migrants. Back in 2000, in the middle of our COVID, I took leadership, Spain took the leadership to convene a big conference to support Venezuelan migrants in Latin America. A small proportion of them are coming to the US or to the EU. The large proportion of Venezuelans living in Venezuela are in Colombia. They are in Ecuador. They are in Peru. They are in Chile. So this conference was about how can we work to address the root causes of the problem in Venezuela and support the countries in the region that have this incredible amount of new citizens that also require social services like healthcare, like education, like water, like sanitation. How can we support the countries in sharing the burden that they face with all these new citizens that find themselves in their territories? So this is what I would say is important also to work on, is to work on the root causes.
Hi, my name is Tisha. I'm an exchange student here from Canada, from the University of Ottawa and the capital, and I'm also on the Model EU team. So my question is, you painted an image on what industries they work in, and I was just wondering if the recognition of the education they gain abroad would help in seeing them more in professional roles, or even investment within programs to fill the gap of the education they receive abroad would help.
Thank you. I do think that one of the most important things, especially with very young migrants, is to make sure they have access to the education systems, whether they are regular or irregular, pushing them to school. Making sure they have access to educational services is essential, because this is what will make the difference in probably their lifetimes. And I say, whether they are regular or irregular. Now, whether they are regular, with the regular, let's say those that have entered and have been recognized with a work permit or with a residence card or with an asylum acceptance of their asylum status, it's probably easier for them, although there are huge issues in language, in background, in culture. It's easier, but let's not forget that there is another stock of those people that are pending a decision on asylum or are irregular in the sense that they entered through irregular means into the territory. I think the priority for every government should be educational system for them, because that's how they can, we can make sure that they can be reintegrated after this experience, in whichever, in the country of origin, in the country of transit, or in the country of arrival.
I am a member of FIU MON, also FIU 3538, and also here. I was hoping you could help me understand a little more. The EU has this thing called the Safe Country List, which includes certain countries that can be in fast track for obtaining asylum for people that come there. Yet it's not inclusive and heavily biased since it does not include countries that were pre-colonized, which constitute more than 60% of the refugees and immigrants that come to the European Union. Is there anything that has been done or is being done right now to address this issue?
Give me an example of what would you consider to be a country that should be in the list that is not.
Well, for example, right now you have, well, India has been removed from it, Togo, Benin, but you have certain countries like Australia, Kosovo, also Ukraine, or the United Kingdom. Yet the OHRCR has announced multiple times that this is not good because if someone is in the safe list, it implies that their conditions of living are good and they do not need asylum.
Okay, so for the benefit of others that may not necessarily understand how this works, there is a list of countries that are considered to be more dangerous, and from which there is a presumption in principle that the asylum should be granted. Not automatically. It's not because you're a national from a country that is on the list that you immediately get an asylum. But there is a presumption that these are more dangerous countries if you are an asylum seeker, and therefore it is more likely to be considered in a positive light. There are others that are not in the list, but you can explain why. If you are being persecuted for political reasons, or you are being persecuted because you belong to a racial minority, or you are persecuted because you belong to a tribe, or you have a sexual orientation, and then you have to explain it. So maybe the explanation has to be a bit longer than from a country. Now, then we have countries that are on the list where the country itself is not unsafe, but the practices that the country may have on asylum seeker may seek to push those asylum seekers to other countries so that the other countries have to deal with them. And then finally, there may be countries in there that don't belong in there. The EU regularly revises the list. And again, there is no direct, there is a presumption, let's say.
Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more what happens to those refugees that do not make part of the list, and what happens with, the Geneva Convention should protect them, but countries like Netherlands have a clause that says a failed asylum seeker must return to the country of origin as soon as their application has been denied, or the authorities will arrange for them to be removed.
So this is where I said one part of this finding a balance between responsibility and solidarity is having criteria in the EU that every country has to respect. This is not the case at the moment. So part of the reform that the EU is undertaking is to make sure that all the countries have the same criteria. Now, the way an asylum request for asylum works, you have to deposit it in the first country where you've entered, who treats your request. You have to explain why. Very often it's very straightforward. This is why out of the 600,000 requests, 300 more or less are accepted, but sometimes it's not as straightforward. This is why 300,000 are also rejected. Sometimes the citizen is a migrant, regular migrant, economic migrant, climate migrant, nothing wrong with it, but it's not an asylum seeker. And his or her request will be rejected. And let me tell you, some countries are much stricter at accepting asylum granting than others. This is where a reform is needed to ensure consistent practices around the EU. Because otherwise, if you don't have consistent practices and different external borders, in reality, people will be attracted to the border where they feel it is more flexible. Thank you. It's working.
Hi, my name is Lauren Sebrian. I'm part of the FIU Model EU. And my question is, in what position do you think countries bordering Ukraine are in right now, especially given the influx of current refugees and their lack of cooperation in the past when refugees were on the other side of Europe?
Yeah, and let me be first very direct. One of the criticisms that the EU has received, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, but it's a criticism, and I want to put it in there, is that some of the countries that were more reluctant to accept refugees in 2015 are the most open now to receive Ukrainian refugees. My answer generally is to first point at the human weakness, which is that you generally tend to be more generous with those people you relate to. That's the human nature. Many of the population in Ukraine have been in history part of countries that are bordering them today, with the borders of today. So some are part of the same families, the same communities, and therefore feel very, very closely associated with what's happening in Ukraine. There's nothing wrong with it. We just need to make sure that we are equally generous when it comes to others. Now, one of the things that the EU has done with Ukraine that it hasn't done, that is being done for the first time, is to activate provisions in the EU legislation that grant the citizens in Ukraine the same rights as EU citizens when they come to the EU. And it's the first time that this has been done, I think, given the extraordinary circumstances that the citizens are facing in Ukraine. So it's in recognition of an extraordinary circumstance that the EU feels that Ukraine is going through. So what is this protection? Is essentially the right for those that are at an age to access the education system, to have access to the education system in the same conditions, to have access to the healthcare services in the same conditions, and to have access to the labor market. Of course, as time passes, the very generous and very open heart attitudes by the recipient countries has to be managed, because obviously it's a pressure on public services, it's pressure on housing, and it's pressure on the labor market. But if you ask me, I would say that the EU is also investing collectively in making sure that the countries that are today supporting those large communities also have the means to do that. The economic means to support the public service, the economic means to integrate these people into their communities. It's very interesting to note that the biggest amounts, the biggest pockets, are in the countries bordering Ukraine, which is an indication that many of these people don't want to go far because they want to return to Ukraine. So they are temporarily displaced in the European Union. Many of them are in Poland, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Moldova, which is not an EU member state, but it's also welcoming a large community, because this, the borders there are very porous in terms of people and history and communities. So everything is being done to recognize the exceptionality of the war in Ukraine, to ensure these people have a temporary protection while they are in the European Union, and to facilitate also the ability of the countries that are welcoming them to manage this huge situation, because it's not, let's face it, it's not easy to manage. Remember, 2015, 1.3 million. Today, close to 5.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Arancha González. I'm a FIU student, also a member of Monnet EU. And I also work for Catholic Charities. I just actually came back from Spain, working with La Sagrada Familia to work with the Ukrainian refugees. So my question to you will be, And what conflict have you noticed between the Ukrainian asylum seekers population and the other countries that also have asylum seekers like Venezuela, Colombia, Syria? In a matter of how well benefited the Ukrainians have been since the beginning, and especially with the new policies that are coming up and all of this help that they have now. That I'm also Venezuelan, so we didn't have in Spain or in Europe.
So, Sofia, let me tell you that Venezuelans in Spain, irrespective of their status, have the same access to healthcare as Spaniards.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Exactly the same one as Ukrainians. In the case of Spain, we do not make a distinction.
Yeah.
It's a very long-standing policy. It was very tough to maintain, but it is a policy stance of a country that believes that healthcare is a public good. Same with education. Every children, Venezuelan, Eritrean, Moroccan, Ukrainian that is in Spain goes to school. What is different is access to the labor market. Now, access to the labor market is not prohibited for other nationalities. It is perfectly okay, but you have to have a regular presence. Okay? In the case of Ukraine, what we are saying is recognizing automatically that because they are fleeing the war in Ukraine temporarily, they will have the same rights as EU citizens. Okay? But it's not, again, that's not that we are not, but because this is part of the DNA of our country, maybe because we've also been a country of migrants in recent history.
Well, I wanted to clarify a little bit, I'm so sorry to follow up. My question is, why do you think is the conflict happening between these other asylum seekers that are feeling, let's say, less important, or feeling like it's not fair? And what's the conflict that you're noticing between these two populations? Not as much as like Europeans itself, more like between asylum seekers. What conflict have you noticed in between them?
So I have noticed, first I have noticed Russian news outlets poking at the differences. I have seen the Russian media flashing a lot on these differences, trying to create grievances within different communities in EU member states, which tells us how important it is to do the public management also of the information and the communication, and how we do it would be extremely important. I have nevertheless noticed not so much differences between Latin Americans and Ukrainians, but I have noticed differences between, say, Ukrainians and Africans, or Central Asians or Middle Easterns in Spain, for example. Although probably Spain is not a good example because our very clear policies on education and healthcare, which are two of the big concerns of every person that migrates, right? But I have seen in the EU less of a difference, let's say less of a resentment on the Latin American side, probably more on the African and on Middle East.
Right. Awesome, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Gonzalez. My name is Arancha González. I'm from the Model UN team. And you guys want to thank you for taking the time today and addressing all of us about this crisis. You kind of touched on this in the beginning of your speech and more so heavily in the conclusion of your speech. I just wanted to know, if any, what influence has political rhetoric had on the formation of policies that appropriately address the influx of refugees within Europe specifically?
Say it again.
How has political rhetoric influenced the formation of policies that address the influx of refugees, specifically within Europe?
Well, rhetoric has weighted very heavily, and it has weighted very heavily on the perception of the citizens about migration, more in some countries than others, but in every country we have seen extreme right political parties or citizen movements that have portrayed this migration in very, very negative terms. We've also seen citizens incredibly generous, welcoming refugees. We've seen communities welcoming those people in their homes, providing shelter, providing means, but they've never been the object of public campaigns. Obviously, the media would be generally looking at what is not working then, rather than looking at what is working, and the political pondering has been on, look, these people, for example, in 2015, it was very clear that part of the rhetoric was, well, you know, these guys from Syria and from Afghanistan and from Iraq, these are all terrorists, and we are getting all these jihadists through the back door into the European Union. And then you had, you know, social media full of images of jihadists saying those jihadists could be with you now because it came unnoticed and nobody checked him at the border. So it's, of course, it has had a big influence in perception. And if you look at the polls on perception vis-a-vis the refugees, and you look at 2015, 16, 17, 18, the perceptions were extremely negative. Now, this tells us that not only do we have to have the proper policies, not only do we have to work on ensuring this right balance between responsibility and solidarity in the EU, but we also have to be very careful at how we manage the public discourse, the language that we use, the terms that we use to describe what is happening, because that's how public opinion is formed today. So we have to be very careful about that and also fight that battle. It's a different battle, but it's all about the same.
Hello, good evening. My name is Anas Ibrahim, and I'm also a member of the Model UN team, and I'm a student at FIU over here. And as you mentioned in the beginning, that migration happens, it's also one of the reasons is a religion. So my question is, what has you done and what they can do in the future to safeguard the religious practices of different minorities such as Muslims? Going into Europe, we still hear cases of different governments maybe putting in laws that are not able to wear the religious clothes, or they're not able to practice fully and publicly. Basically, what can the EU do in the future to safeguard these minorities and the practices?
Yeah, it's Article 1 of the EU Treaty. No discrimination for reasons of race, gender, religion, and the list goes on. And it's an ongoing battle, and it's an ongoing fight. It's not finished. There are different models in the European Union because the relation between religion and countries in Europe is different. Some countries are secular countries. They don't have religion as a national religion of the country. And there is a division between religion that you practice in your private sphere and the state, whose role is to guarantee that every religion can be practiced in the private sphere, but does not allow for any religion to be, let's say, part of civil life or political life. Whereas some other countries have one religion as the religion, the national religion of the country, right? So we live with this difference within the EU. I think sometimes we have, I think I believe that, if you ask me, I believe that every citizen should be able and allowed to practice his or her religion, but I also believe in the separation between religion and state. I want the state to not be religious while guaranteeing the ability of every citizen in a tolerant manner to practice his or her religion. I also strongly believe that the religion should not impinge into civil life. And that's the lines between all of these are very difficult to maintain. We have seen in Europe countries that have banned religious symbols because they did not want any religious symbol to be part of civil life. We have seen also the banning of religious symbols for political reasons. I think in Europe we still got a bit of work to do in ensuring that there is respect also for religion, and that there is no targeting of a specific religions. We have, for example, a problem with anti-Semitism that we still need to be very sensitive about, given the history that we have. So it's work in progress. But I would tell you that the sensitivities are different depending on the EU member states. We had a big discussion, you know, when we built the EU treaty, we had a big discussion about whether or not the EU treaty should recognize the Christian roots of the European Union. We had a huge debate, and we decided after this big debate not to put it in the treaty, understanding that the EU obviously has Christian roots. But if you ask me, in a country like Spain, if I look at the roots of my country has Muslim roots, it has Jewish roots, it has Christian roots, it has many roots, because it's been home to many different civilizations and religious groups and people that have crossed and have made what the country is today. But we had this discussion, and we agreed to disagree. This is why this is an ongoing, let's say it's an ongoing fight that we need to continue fighting. Thank you.